The woods had always been their place. For as long as Tommy could remember, the forest behind his town was where he and his friends had gone to escape the monotony of school, home, and all the little responsibilities that came with growing up. It wasn't just a stretch of trees for them. It was a world of adventure, a place where anything seemed possible. But that afternoon, something was different. The air was heavy, still like the forest was holding its breath. "Do you guys see that?" Tommy stopped in his tracks, pointing at the ground ahead of them. Rachel squinted. "What, the leaves?" "No," Tommy replied, stepping forward. "Look at the ground, there under the brush." Jake and Ben exchanged glances but followed Tommy as he crouched near the spot. At first, it just seemed like a normal patch of earth, but as Tommy swept away the thick carpet of leaves, he revealed something else entirely, a shallow mound of disturbed dirt. "It's a grave," Rachel whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The word grave hung in the air, sending an involuntary chill through Tommy. It didn't make sense. There were no markers, no signs, just a rough, hastily covered patch of ground. They all stood around it now, the reality of what they were seeing sinking in. "Unmarked," Ben added, his voice barely audible. "Why would someone bury something out here with no marker?" Jake, ever the adventurous one, crouched beside Tommy. "Only one way to find out." Tommy hesitated, his fingers twitching against the cool earth. A part of him wanted to walk away, to pretend they'd never found this place, but another part, an irresistible pull of curiosity, made him stay. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. None of them did. And yet, there was something unsettling about this spot, something wrong. "I don't know if we should do this," Rachel said, taking a step back. "What if it's probably nothing." Jake was already tugging at the earth with his hands. "Maybe an old pet or something. Come on, we've come this far." Tommy sighed and reluctantly began to help, digging with his hands alongside Jake. Ben joined in next, though Rachel kept her distance, arms crossed, watching nervously. As they dug deeper, the damp earth beneath their fingers began to reveal something solid. Wood, old and rotten. The scent of wet dirt mixed with the faint smell of decay. It was an odd combination that made Tommy's stomach churn. "Guys, this doesn't feel right," Tommy muttered. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. But Jake was already working to free the box from the ground. With one final heave, they pulled it free. It was an old, battered chest, small, no bigger than a suitcase, with rusted hinges and chains wrapped tightly around it, barely holding the decaying wood together. "Who chains up a box and buries it?" Ben asked, his voice trembling slightly. His earlier bravado had faded. Tommy swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know, but again, that curiosity, that unexplainable pull, urged them on. Rachel finally spoke up, her voice thin. "I think we should leave it alone. Whatever's in there, it was buried for a reason." Jake shook his head, determination set in his jaw. "We've come this far, we can't just leave it." The chain gave way easily, its links rusted and fragile. With a creak, Jake pried the chest open. The lid splintered as it came apart, revealing its contents. Inside, the air seemed to shift, the woods growing eerily quiet as if they were being watched. "What the hell is that?" Ben's voice cracked, his eyes wide. The box contained 3 objects, each more bizarre than the last. On top lay a tarnished pocket watch, its surface dull but still ticking with a faint, rhythmic click. Beside it, an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and stained with time, the leather cracked and peeling at the edges. But the final object made Tommy's breath catch in his throat. A withered, skeletal hand, its fingers curled as though it had been grasping something long ago. They all stared at the grotesque relic, their collective silence filled with disbelief. "Okay, we definitely shouldn't have opened this," Rachel said, her voice wavering as she stepped backward. That's a human hand, right? We need to leave. Now." But no one moved. Tommy's eyes were fixed on the journal, drawn to the weathered leather. He felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, as if it was calling him, demanding to be opened. But before he could reach for it, Jake scooped up the pocket watch, turning it over in his hands. "Probably some kind of antique," Jake mused, his voice filled with excitement, as though they had uncovered treasure. "Treasure?" Tommy shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the journal. "It's not treasure, Jake. Someone buried this stuff for a reason." Ben, who had been nervously glancing around the woods, grabbed the withered hand and tossed it aside, grimacing. "Whatever it is, it's probably been here for 100 years. No one's coming back for it." Tommy finally reached for the journal, his fingers brushing the rough cover. A strange sensation washed over him, cold, prickling. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, but he ignored it. He opened the journal, flipping through its fragile pages, though he could barely make out the faded writing inside. He snapped it shut, a chill running down his spine. "We shouldn't have done this," Jake shrugged, pocketing the watch. "Relax, Tommy. It's just old junk. No one's gonna care." But as they started to head back, leaving the broken chest and its secrets behind, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the ground. Shadows clung to the corners of his vision, darker than they had been before. It wasn't just the discovery that unnerved him. It was the sense that, in opening that chest, they had disturbed something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting. And as they disappeared deeper into the woods, back toward home, Tommy couldn't shake the creeping sensation that they weren't alone anymore. The nightmares began the same night they uncovered the grave. Tommy hadn't thought much of it at first. Who wouldn't have strange dreams after digging up a buried box containing a withered hand and eerie trinkets? He had gone to bed feeling uneasy, the events of the day swirling in his mind. But when he closed his eyes, the images were far more vivid than he could have ever imagined. It started with a man, his face pale and thin, his eyes hollow and empty. He was filthy, his clothes ragged and torn, his skin stretched tight over his bony frame. The man stood in a graveyard, digging feverishly, his hands caked in dirt and blood. The moon overhead was full, casting an unnatural blood-red glow over the scene. And then the man would turn, slowly, his empty eyes locking onto Tommy's. That look, those hollow, accusing eyes, haunted Tommy even as he jolted awake in a cold sweat. His sheets were tangled around him, and his heart pounded in his chest as though he had been running for miles. He sat up, gasping for air, but the room around him was still and silent. It had only been a dream, he told himself, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Just a nightmare. But the nightmares didn't stop. Each night the dream returned, darker and more vivid than the last. The man, who Tommy now knew to be the same figure they had disturbed in the woods, seemed to come closer with every dream, his gaunt, accusing face never wavering, his bony fingers pointing at Tommy as if blaming him for something terrible. The journal, which Tommy had taken from the grave, lay untouched on his bedside table. He hadn't dared open it again after that first night, but it seemed to draw his attention constantly, like it was whispering to him. After 3 sleepless nights, he gave in. On the 4th night, Tommy flipped open the journal once more. The pages were fragile and yellowed with age, but the writing was clearer than he remembered. As he skimmed the entries, a story began to unfold, a story that chilled him to his core. The journal belonged to a man named John Massey, a grave robber. Massey had made his living by stealing from the dead, digging up graves in search of jewelry, watches, and anything else of value that the deceased might have been buried with. He had been greedy, ruthless, and unrepentant, at least until he'd made a terrible mistake. The writing in the journal became frantic, almost illegible, as Massey recounted how he had dug up the grave of a woman believed to have been a witch. According to Massey, the woman had cursed him as he desecrated her burial site, her voice echoing in his ears long after he had stolen her possessions. He had tried to laugh it off at first, convinced it was just a trick of the mind, but the curse was real. Tommy's hands trembled as he read the last few entries. Massey had written about how he'd been haunted by visions, dark, twisted nightmares where the woman's rotting corpse appeared to him, her hands reaching out to drag him into the earth. His life had quickly unraveled after that. His health had failed, his mind had decayed, and in his final, desperate days, he had written the journal as a warning. "I beg of you," one entry read in jagged, shaking handwriting, "do not disturb what lies in the ground. The dead are not meant to be unearthed." Tommy slammed the journal shut, his heart racing. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as the realization sank in. The man in his dreams, the one with the hollow eyes, was John Massey, and somehow Tommy had disturbed him. No, it wasn't just Massey's journal they had uncovered. It was his grave. Tommy and his friends had unknowingly unleashed the curse Massey had written about, and now they were paying the price. The following day, Tommy tried to shake off the nightmares, but a feeling of dread clung to him like a second skin. He went to school, distracted and on edge, half listening to the teachers drone on about things that no longer seemed important. His friends were just as shaken. Rachel looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. Ben, usually so full of life, was uncharacteristically quiet, and Jake, who had always been the brave one, seemed jumpy, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. They didn't talk about the grave, not openly, but Tommy could see it in their eyes. They were all thinking about it, haunted by what they had seen and what they had done. Later that afternoon, they gathered at Tommy's house, sitting in his room in an uncomfortable silence. Tommy could barely stand to look at the journal on his bedside table, but Jake broke the tension first. "You guys having nightmares too?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. He didn't wait for an answer. "I've been seeing him, the guy from the grave. He's in my dreams every night, watching me. I don't know what the hell's going on, but I don't like it." Rachel nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she hugged her knees. "It's not just dreams. Weird stuff is happening in my house. I keep hearing things, footsteps, whispers, but no one's there. My dog went missing yesterday. He just disappeared." Ben didn't say anything, but the fear in his eyes was obvious. Tommy could see it. They were all feeling it, the growing presence of something dark, something malevolent that had followed them from the woods. Tommy spoke up, his voice shaky. "It's the curse. I read the journal. The guy we found, his name was John Massey. He was a grave robber and he was cursed by a witch. The stuff we took, it wasn't just junk. It's part of the curse. And now we've disturbed it." Silence fell over the room. The weight of Tommy's words sank in like cold water. None of them wanted to believe it, but they couldn't deny what was happening. The curse was real, and they had triggered it. "We need to get rid of it," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "We need to take everything back, put it all back in the grave, and forget this ever happened." Jake shook his head, his fists clenched. "I tried. I threw the watch out, but when I woke up, it was back in my room. I can't get rid of it. It's like it's following me." Tommy felt his chest tighten, the panic rising in his throat. There was no escape from the curse. The more they tried to rid themselves of the artifacts, the stronger the haunting became. The curse wasn't just tied to the objects, it had latched onto them. They had become part of the curse, and it wasn't letting go. That night, Tommy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the nightmares to return. He knew they would. He knew that Massey's hollow, accusing eyes would find him again, just as they had every night since they had disturbed his grave. The weight of the curse pressed down on him, suffocating, relentless. There was no escape, and deep down, Tommy knew this was only the beginning. The nightmares were no longer confined to Tommy's sleep. They had started leaking into his waking hours, staining the edges of his reality with an unsettling blur. The line between dream and reality was becoming harder to define. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of wind carried Massey's rasping voice, and every reflection in the mirror made Tommy shudder. He could feel the eyes, those hollow, accusing eyes, watching him, always watching. It wasn't just him. The curse had spread, weaving itself into the lives of his friends, binding them in a way none of them could escape. Jake was the first to truly crack. It happened one cold, gray evening. Tommy was in his room, staring at the journal, trying to make sense of Massey's frantic, disjointed entries when his phone buzzed violently on the nightstand. He grabbed it, heart racing, and saw Jake's name flashing on the screen. The call was breathless, panicked, and full of desperation. "Tommy, he's in my room. The grave guy, he's here." Tommy froze, gripping the phone tighter. "Jake, what are you talking about?" "He's just standing there at the foot of my bed," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't move. I don't know what to do. His eyes. Oh God, his eyes." Tommy's stomach lurched, his pulse hammered in his ears. "Jake, you need to leave. Get out of there. Right now." A sharp intake of breath, a thud, silence. "Jake," Tommy shouted into the phone. "Jake!" But there was nothing, only the low hum of static before the line went dead. Tommy bolted out of his room, panic coursing through him as he sprinted down the stairs, nearly knocking over his mother in the process. He grabbed his bike from the garage and rode as fast as he could to Jake's house, his heart pounding with every pedal stroke. When he arrived, the front door was wide open, the house eerily quiet. Tommy rushed inside, calling Jake's name, but there was no answer. He ran upstairs to Jake's room, his breath shallow and ragged, but the room was empty. The bed was a mess, the sheets torn from the mattress, and the window was wide open, curtains billowing in the wind. Jake was gone. The police were called. They searched the house, the surrounding area, and the woods where the unmarked grave lay, but they found nothing. No trace of Jake, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and dread. Tommy barely slept, and when he did, the nightmares returned, worse than before. Massey was no longer a distant figure in the dreamscape. He was right there, in the room, leaning over Tommy's bed, his breath cold against Tommy's skin. And always, those eyes, hollow, empty, and filled with an unspeakable rage. Rachel was the next to fall. She had been acting strange since Jake's disappearance. She avoided the group, barely spoke, and when Tommy did manage to talk to her, she seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Her once lively, sharp demeanor had dulled, her eyes clouded with something Tommy couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or something worse. It wasn't until Ben called him one night, frantic and breathless, that Tommy realized just how bad things had gotten. "Rachel's gone too," Ben said, his voice shaking. "Her parents found her walking into the woods in the middle of the night. She didn't even know she was doing it. They locked her in her room, but she's not the same, Tommy. She just keeps staring at the window, and she's talking about him, the grave guy. She keeps saying he's waiting for her." Tommy's heart sank. He had known deep down that this would happen. The curse was tightening its grip on all of them, pulling them closer to Massey's grasp. They had disturbed something ancient and malevolent, and now it was coming for them, one by one. He biked over to Rachel's house the next day, hoping to talk to her, to get some sense of what was going on in her head. But when he arrived, her parents were frantic, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "She's gone," her mother said, her voice a brittle whisper. "We thought she was asleep, but when we went to check on her this morning, she's gone." Tommy felt the world tilt beneath him, his legs turning weak. Rachel, like Jake, had disappeared without a trace. Ben was the last to go. After Rachel vanished, Ben refused to sleep. He started carrying a baseball bat around the house, muttering about how he wasn't going to let the curse take him like it had taken the others. He stopped going to school, locked himself in his room, and wouldn't talk to anyone except Tommy. The watch he had taken from the grave was still with him, ticking endlessly, no matter how many times he tried to get rid of it. "I threw it into the lake," he said one night, his voice hollow. "But it was back on my nightstand the next morning. It's like it wants to stay with me." Tommy shuddered, remembering Jake's watch and how it had reappeared no matter what Jake had done to destroy it. Then one day, Ben stopped answering his phone. Tommy biked to his house, dread pooling in his stomach the entire way. When he arrived, the house was empty. Ben's parents were away, and Ben's room was locked from the inside. Tommy broke the window to get in, only to find Ben sprawled on the floor, unconscious. His head was bleeding, a deep gash across his forehead, and the watch lay next to him, ticking steadily. Ben never woke up. He was alive but unresponsive, trapped in some strange coma the doctors couldn't explain. Tommy visited him in the hospital, but Ben's body was a shell, his mind elsewhere, lost in whatever dark place the curse had taken him. Now Tommy was alone. He could feel it tightening around him, the curse, like invisible hands slowly closing in. Massey's figure haunted his every step, appearing in mirrors, in windows, in the corners of his vision. The air around him seemed colder, heavier, and the shadows in his house moved in unnatural ways. Massey wasn't content to stay in the grave any longer. He was here, with Tommy, all the time, watching. Desperate, Tommy tried to return the journal, the pocket watch, and the hand to the grave. He thought that maybe if he put everything back, the curse would break, but it didn't work. The earth wouldn't accept the objects. Every time he tried to bury them, the ground seemed to push them back, like it was rejecting them. Each night, Massey appeared closer, his face gaunt and skeletal, his eyes burning with that same relentless accusation. Tommy had no idea what Massey wanted, but he knew this wasn't just a haunting. This was a death sentence, and Tommy was running out of time. Tommy stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. The air was colder tonight, sharp against his skin, cutting through his clothes. The familiar trees, once a refuge for him and his friends, now loomed like skeletal sentinels, casting long, twisted shadows under the pale light of the moon. Somewhere, deep inside those woods, was the grave, the unmarked, cursed grave that had brought his life to the brink of madness. He clutched the journal in one hand, the pocket watch in the other, his knuckles white with the tension of his grip. The withered hand was stuffed into his backpack, wrapped in an old cloth to hide its grotesque form. His heart pounded with the same relentless rhythm as the ticking of the watch, each second slipping away faster than the last. He knew what he had to do now, even if it meant paying the ultimate price. There was no one left to save. Jake, Rachel, Ben. They were all gone, taken by the curse in one way or another. Tommy had tried everything to stop it, to reverse what they had unleashed. He had tried burying the items, burning them, even begging whatever dark force was haunting him to take pity. But nothing worked. The curse had latched onto them like a parasite, feeding off their fear, their lives, until it had taken all it wanted. Now it was just him, the last one, and Massey, the cursed grave robber whose hollow eyes haunted his every waking moment, wanted one final thing: his life. The woods seemed to swallow him whole as he stepped past the first row of trees, the undergrowth crunching softly beneath his feet. The path was familiar, but tonight it felt different, darker, as though the trees themselves were closing in around him, guiding him toward the grave. He didn't need a flashlight. He knew exactly where he was going. As he walked, his mind swirled with memories of his friends. Jake laughing as they biked through town, always the fearless one. Rachel, smart and sarcastic, with that knowing smile that said she was in control, until she wasn't. Ben, the one who tried to stay brave until the end, even as the curse consumed him. Tommy had been the one to drag them into this. It was his curiosity that had led them to dig up the grave. And now he would be the one to end it. The clearing came into view. The mound of earth where the unmarked grave lay was still there, undisturbed, just as they had left it. But the air around it felt different now, heavier, charged with a dark energy that made the hairs on the back of Tommy's neck stand on end. Massey was waiting. The grave robber's figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakable. His hollow eyes gleamed in the dark, locked onto Tommy with a burning intensity. His skeletal form seemed to hover just above the ground, a dark, twisted shadow of the man he once was. And though Massey's lips never moved, Tommy could hear his voice, cold and rasping, in the back of his mind. "You know what must be done." Tommy swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands shaking as he walked toward the grave. He dropped to his knees, the damp earth cold beneath him, and began to dig. His fingers clawed at the soil, tearing it away in chunks, faster and faster as the weight of the curse pressed down on him. The journal and the pocket watch fell to the ground beside him, forgotten for the moment as he worked. The earth felt wrong beneath his hands, dense, almost as if it resisted him, pushing back with every handful of dirt he moved. But Tommy kept going, the desperation in his chest growing with every second. He could feel Massey's eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to finish. "This is the only way." The voice whispered again, cold and unrelenting. He didn't know how long he dug before the hole was deep enough. His arms ached, his fingers raw and bleeding, but he didn't stop until it was done. The earth had opened up before him, a gaping wound in the forest floor. Tommy stood, breathing heavily, and reached into his backpack, pulling out the wrapped hand. The sight of it, the brittle, lifeless fingers, made his stomach twist, but he didn't hesitate this time. He placed it into the hole, followed by the journal and the pocket watch. The cursed items had brought all of this upon them, and now they were being returned to the grave where they belonged. But even as he covered the items with dirt, Tommy knew it wasn't enough. The ground resisted, pushing the soil back, as though rejecting the offer. The earth wouldn't take the artifacts back. The curse wasn't tied to these objects anymore. It was tied to him. The truth hit him like a wave, sudden and cold. Massey hadn't come for the items. He had come for Tommy. The curse could only be broken with a life. Tommy's breath caught in his throat as he stood, staring at the half-filled grave in front of him. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound in the deathly silence of the night. Massey's figure shifted in the shadows, growing closer, his presence suffocating, oppressive. Tommy knelt back down, his hands trembling. He knew what he had to do, but every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But there was no escape. Massey would follow him to the ends of the earth. The curse would never stop until it had claimed its final victim. With shaking hands, Tommy began to dig again. Not to bury, but to prepare. He was digging his own grave. The hole deepened, each shovel of dirt pulling him closer to his fate. Massey loomed over him, silent, watching, his satisfaction palpable in the air. Tommy could feel the presence of death closing in around him, cold and unforgiving. When the grave was finally deep enough, Tommy paused, kneeling in the freshly turned earth. His heart pounded in his chest, fear clawing at his throat. But there was no going back now. He had to end this. He climbed into the grave. The moment his body touched the cold earth, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, his limbs heavy as though the ground itself was pulling him down. Tommy lay back, staring up at the sky. The moon hung overhead, distant and pale, as though it were watching him too. Massey's figure leaned over the edge of the grave, his hollow eyes gleaming with satisfaction. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, his skeletal fingers curling into the air as though beckoning Tommy to let go. "Oh, it's done," the voice whispered. "You've paid the price." Tommy's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his vision blurring as the edges of his world grew dark. The weight of the earth pressed down on him, pulling him deeper into its cold embrace. He felt himself slipping away, the curse finally loosening its grip as Massey's figure faded into the shadows. The last thing Tommy saw before the darkness claimed him was the trees swaying gently above, their branches reaching for the stars, and in the stillness of the woods, he thought he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a voice, soft and distant, thanking him. Then there was nothing, and the woods fell silent once more.